So for my second talk, I must admit I have a struggle. I'm not sure what to call it. I've come up with a talk, but I haven't come up with a title. Now, usually when I give a talk, I like the title to explain what the talk's going to be about. Workflows of refactoring, you know that's going to be a talk about, well, workflows of refactoring. If I give a talk about schemaless data structures, you know it's going to be about schemaless data structures. But this talk is a bit of a journey, and I don't want to kind of tell you where I'm going. I want you to explore the ground with me. So as a result, a title is a bit tricky. And I'm going to begin this journey by talking about a frustration with the Agile software world. Now, a lot of people, particularly those who are in the early days of the Agile movement, are frustrated with Agile software development in various ways. They'll talk about the problems of people who take on the management practices but not the technical practices, leading to a condition that I've called flaccid scrum. Yep, it exists. Look it up on the internet if you want to be sure. Other people might complain about the big name methodologies, the scrums, the safes, and how they've kind of dominated things. Or people focusing on practices and not on principles. There are lots of complaints out there. My complaint is a bit more specific. And to understand it, we have to go back to what the world was like before the Agile world got going. In particular, how our attitude was to software requirements. And it's summed up really rather beautifully by this quote. I just love that. Such wonderful attitude in it. And attitude of the times. If you didn't get all your requirements right, I mean, that was just clearly ridiculous. And so we had a world that said what you wanted to do was come up with everything you wanted to do and then write the code. Now, one of the great things that Agile has done is really torpedoed that quote. Now we're used to the idea of breaking up all of our needs into individual little units. Typically we call them stories if you're in most Agile approaches. And then using those stories and gradually, just one at a time or a few at a time, and turning them into code. And we don't even have to completely figure out all the stories before we begin. Some of them are very vague, some of them will appear during the course of the project. That shift towards an incremental delivery gives us great benefits. We're able to get better feedback. We're able to see what does our system look like and use that knowledge to feed into our ideas of what we should be building. It allows steering to be better because we can see clearer signs of what progress we're making. We're less likely to be in a situation where we think we're 80% done, but in fact we're only 20% done, which was a very common thing when I was starting out. All of that kind of capability has been really valuable. And I really like the way the Agile movement has caused that kind of change. And the projects I talk to aren't having the same kinds of problems that I ran into 20 years ago. But there is still a problem with this process, and it's really summed up by that arrow. There is still a very strong notion that programming and programmers receive information from outside, from the business, from analysts or whatever, and then they go and they write their code in response to that. If we think of it in terms of three stereotypical roles, users, analysts, and programmers, the notion that's very common is that, well, users have needs, and those needs can't be clearly expressed by the users, right? People can tell you what they want, but they're not very good at telling you what they need. Our job is to figure out what they need and give them something that helps them with that. What they want is just a clue to get us to what they need, and often a very deceptive clue. That's why the analysis part is difficult. So in a common workflow, you have analysts that will consider those needs, try and understand what they are, and come up with stories, little statements of intent of what they think the software should do. Then these stories they pass on to the programmers, and the programmers then create code and deliver the code through to the user. But it's seen very much as this kind of one-way traffic. The programmers sit there and have stories dropped on them. And that, to me, is a huge disappointment, because it's not how things were when I started in this Agile game. When we were at the meeting at Snowbird, where we came up with the Agile Manifesto, we tossed around various words that we felt should be this new kind of stuff. The word we chose in the end was Agile, but the various other words we considered. And one word that we particularly liked was one that Kent proposed, which was conversational. His notion was that instead of just receiving requirements, whether they be nicely chopped up or not, instead we should collaborate. That programmers and analysts and users, ideally, here I'm just showing programmers and analysts, should collaborate to figure out what the story should be. That programmers are often the best source of innovative ideas. And that's a theme I've heard from a number of product managers who say, often our most innovative stuff comes from suggestions from programmers. And they come up with these suggestions because they know the technology, they know what can be done. And as a result, they can come up with things that people who are less knowledgeable about technology don't even think about. It's something we at ThoughtWorks struggle with to a certain degree because we're an external company. And we have to try and be able to come in, and we want to do more of that innovative work. But we find we can often do that because we have that technical knowledge. Things that people wouldn't even think of to ask for, we can say, that would be something that we could do. Now, in the end, it is the product owner, typically a business-oriented role, that will decide what things get done in what order. That final decision is something that falls on the customer's side. But the ideas of what is possible and what could be done, they can come from anywhere. And one of my big frustration with what Agile, as I hear and see it, is that we're not doing enough of this. We're not having enough of these conversations about what to build. The programming side is not involved enough in coming up with what is to be done. Now, a lot of the fault of this, of course, is organizational. A kind of cultural thing that says, oh, well, programmers, they go off in their little hidey hole and they come up with stuff. They don't come up with business ideas. But it's not just that. If programmers are to help come up with these intents, these ideas that we turn into stories, they need knowledge of the domain that we're working with. And I have had a lot of frustration when I get a sense when programmers say, oh, well, I don't really need to know very much about the domain. I'll just do what they're told me to program. I think that's a great shame. I think it's important that programmers need to understand the domains that they're working with and try and study them and use similar techniques that analysts use. Analysts determine these intents by looking at needs. They do studies, they do interviews. Programmers should do some of that as well. Maybe not spend as much time, but certainly spend some time. It was really sad to me listening to a programmer who was doing some really interesting stuff in gene sequence manipulation. And he was frustrated because other senior, very technical developers came onto the project and they didn't want to learn that much about gene sequencing. I mean, he got textbooks, he watched videos about gene sequencing. He really wanted to understand a lot about the domain. And he was frustrated that many of his colleagues, they just wanted to be told what to do. And I think that's an important thing that we need to shift, is to do that. And this is particularly true because now an important source of these intents, these requirements, are the actual system itself. We learn a great deal about what should be done next by looking at how a system is currently behaving and looking at the monitoring and deriving what would be useful. This is, I think, the wonderful final reversal of that quote that I mentioned earlier on. That here we've actually built the system and we're using it to determine future requirements. That's something that is completely literally mind-blowing to people who are steeped back in that era. So one thing I think we should do as programmers more, particularly in the Agile world, is do that. Learn about your domain. engage with the process of figuring out what would be an appropriate thing for software to do. And that means you need knowledge. But it also brings in something else. It brings in some responsibility towards your users and to think about the consequences of what it is you're building. And I have a couple of examples where I think this is really vitally important. How many here have come across the concept of dark patterns? Anybody? Anybody look? There's a website about it. Go to darkpatterns.org. It's a term used for software, primarily through the user interface, but it can be other places as well, that tries to trick the user into doing things that are not to their benefit. So an example is, hey, sign up, subscribe to get this, cheap freebie thing, and then in very small print on a 30% grey font it says, by clicking this you are subscribing to a recurring monthly payment of a disgusting amount of euros. That's a dark pattern, right? You're hiding from the user what it is that you're actually doing, and you are actually doing something that you think they wouldn't want to do themselves. That's why you're covering it up. That's why you're using that 30% grey font. Now that's a very simple case, but this site documents many more sophisticated ways in which user interfaces try to trick people into doing things that we think they wouldn't want to do. As progress, now dark patterns are bad. Some person, I think, who was of questionable morals came up with the idea to do that. But also, programmers programmed it. They are complicit in doing out those dark patterns. They are every bit as responsible as whoever said, you should do that. If we want to take a more active role in our society, which I think we should do, we need to start pushing back against this kind of thing. I personally would say that it would be perfectly reasonable for a programmer to... it's one of the arguments, I think, in favor of such things as software, as licensing programmers, which is in generally a tricky area. But one benefit of doing that is you could revoke somebody's license for doing that. I think it would be perfectly okay in America to sue a programmer who did this. Even if I don't think just following my analyst's instructions is a good defense. In the end, that's just following orders, and we know where that gets you. We need to push back about dark patterns. And if you find yourself in a position where you're being told to implement some dark patterns, you should really think about what the consequences of that are. Push back. And remember, we are incredibly fortunate as software developers. We have the opportunity to be well paid, and we've got actually a lot of opportunity for jobs. ThoughtWorks is operating in Germany, and we know that it's damned hard to hire developers. Really, really tough. So what that means as a developer is you've got a lot of opportunity out there. Do you want to be working for an outfit that's producing dark patterns? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Thank you. So it's important that you become advocates for your users. Another side of this, that's another example of this, is a concept that I recently wrote about on my Blicky that I'm now going to horribly mangle the name, Datenspeicherkeit. Is that not too bad? You laughed. It must be pretty bad. Okay, so the idea here is we're all talking about big data and collecting lots of data and doing things with it. But a lot of that data can be used for very bad purposes if it leaks out, or even if it doesn't leak out. The test I put is, you're going to collect all this data about your users. How would you feel if that data appears on WikiLeaks? Because let's face it, it's going to get cracked. Criminals are going to crack it, activists are going to crack it, the NSA is going to crack it. You have a significant risk that any data you store is going to appear publicly somewhere. How are you going to feel about that when that happens? And I think an important part of what we need to do is to figure out how to store less data, How can we achieve what we want to do in business and domain terms and not store data that's going to be a problem if it leaks out? I'm hoping that this is going to be an important part of our debate in the future. It's another part of our responsibility to our users to do no harm. A lot of times, the business people don't really understand the consequences and the risks around this. And it's our responsibility to make it clear what those are. Good. I'll take that as an agreement. We can expand a bit further on this. Well, I've talked about how users have needs, turned into intents, turned into code. But we also have to think about another thing. What impact is the user having upon the world? One of my great disappointments for my generation is how many really bright minds have used their intellectual abilities to do very sophisticated gambling in the financial capitals of this world instead of solving some serious problems. You know, I look at it in a very disappointed way. I feel a lot of effort, and a lot of people I know, a lot of friends of mine, spend a lot of time working really hard to make sure that rich people are made much richer. And I feel there's a sad question mark about that. And we have to think about the impact our code has when it supports the users doing what they do. Now, when saying this, I don't want to go in. I think we have to think about the difference between thinking about what our code does in terms of social justice and not saying that it's necessarily meaning that we've all got to abandon what we do and work building homes for starving people in Africa. A lot of good, productive work is the ordinary stuff. I remember giving a talk that touched on this once, and a guy came up to me and he said how much he liked what I had to say, and he said, I don't do anything really socially responsible, I do printer drivers. And before I could even respond, the guy behind him says, but that is useful, because I just had to buy a house. I had to print out loads and loads of forms. Having a printer, being able to do that was really useful to me. There was social benefit in producing printer drivers. And I think that's a lot of our day-to-day work. We have to step back and say, are what we're doing, and is a business process we're supporting, valuable in terms of making people's lives better? It doesn't have to cure the enormous influences of the world, but it does have to be socially useful. My problem with a lot of things inside the financial industry is I don't think they're actually doing socially useful stuff. That's my opinion. I think what we all have to do as programmers is ask that question about what we're doing. Is what we're doing having a good social impact on the world? And as I said, there's no great answer to any of these questions, but it is something we have to look at. And for my last point, I want to think a little bit about the impact our code as a whole has on the world and what we as communities of programmers should consider. And I think there are two issues that we overall as a software development community need to pay a great deal of attention to in our impact on the world as a whole. The first of these is around the whole issue of privacy and making sure the internet remains a free area to collaborate. We've all seen the rules. Thank you. We've all seen the news about mass surveillance and things of that kind. I think we have a particularly important role in fighting back against that. Many of my colleagues are looking at ways to try and deal with this. How do we reduce the centralization of things? How do we increase the use of encryption? At the moment, to send encrypted emails is a right pain in the backside. Well, we as software developers ought to fix that problem and make sure that encrypted email sending becomes normal for everybody. And make it easier to decentralize the process so that people who are looking to do mass surveillance can't just go to one spot, they have to go to many spots. By making it harder to do mass surveillance, we're able to reduce the load it takes upon us. And we have to be participating in that. We can do it by writing software, and we can do it by explaining how it matters to other people. I think a lot of people underestimate the degree of what goes on with internet surveillance and the impact it can have on the world. We have to take a role to do something about that, and we have to make our voices known. I just want to mention that next week February the 11th, there's a big internet-oriented protest thing being organized called The Day We Fight Back. I've got some information on it on my homepage. If you take a look there, it's being sponsored by organizations like the Electronic Freedom Foundation and various other organizations, including ThoughtWorks, are taking part. It's focused a great deal upon the United States, because obviously of all the stuff going on with the NSA there. But everybody in the world can make an impact by making a noise and really making things shout. A lot of people said we couldn't affect political decisions, and particularly in the United States. But a year ago, the protests around SOPA and PIPA showed that they were wrong, where a dead certain piece of nasty legislation was overturned almost overnight. And we need to speak out and use our power effectively to make the world better. And the second thing is, I think we have a responsibility to do something about the alienating atmosphere that hangs over many people, particularly those historically discriminated against groups in the software profession and in the wider world. I suspect many of you have seen many of the really nasty things that have happened to women who have spoken out over the last year or so. It's not difficult to find all sorts of ugly incidents, both within the software world and beyond the software world. And we have to figure out how to get rid of that. That's not the world I want to live in, where people are dissuaded from taking part, dissuaded from being on the internet because of the actions of various louts and hooligans that I'm ashamed to consider as human beings. And we have to figure out how to deal with that. We have to figure out how, within the software community, to get rid of that alienating atmosphere that exists within us, which is partly just recognizing that it's there. A lot of people, particularly privileged white guys like me, don't realize it exists. And we have to recognize that and figure out how to deal with it. It also means that when we think about the software and the systems that we build, we have to recognize how to make a place safe for others. I mean, Twitter have had a lot of problems because they have often not taken steps to recognize when abuse is occurring across the internet and aren't taking measures enough. And lots of us are in the situations where we're in environments where we can have an influence on this. And I see this as another area where we have to take forward, take a lead, and try and change our society to make it look like a better place. So whether it's within questioning our requirements, getting into conversations and thinking about what we're building, to a more bigger story of engaging with the world, now I think I'm at a point to think about what a title might be for this talk. That we aren't and we should not see ourselves as people who are just slinging code and solving technical problems in some kind of isolated bubble. Our code has an enormous impact upon the world outside. We know that. We can just look around. All around us, code is affecting the world. We programmers have to engage with that world and figure out how to make sure that our code is making the world better and not worse. That is our responsibility. And I certainly hope that many of you will think about this and think about how we can change the world and make it better, and how we encourage younger software developers to think of themselves as people who are actively engaged in the world and not just slinging code for whoever tells them to do things. And on that note, I've way run out of time, so I thank you for your forbearance. Thank you.